January 17, 1945, Luzon Island, Philippines, 347 hours. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and damp canvas. Inside a cramped tent on the eastern perimeter of Clark Air Base, a lone radar officer sat hunched over a glowing screen, his face bathed in pale green phosphorescence. His name was Lieutenant James T. Harrington, 23 years old, from a wheat farm outside Topeka, Kansas. He had been awake for 19 hours. The oscilloscope before him painted sweeping arcs of light across its face, each pulse a heartbeat of invisible energy reaching into the night sky. Outside, the jungle whispered. Insects screamed. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator coughed and sputtered. Harrington rubbed his eyes and reached for the frequency dial. His fingers, slick with sweat, slipped. The dial spun farther than he intended. The screen flickered, and then suddenly it bloomed with light. Dozens of contacts. Hundreds, perhaps. A constellation of blips stretching across the display like stars scattered across a vast electronic sky. Harrington stared. His hand froze. For a moment he thought the equipment had malfunctioned, but the contacts did not fade. They did not flicker. They moved, slowly, deliberately, converging. He reached for the field telephone, his heart hammering against his ribs. Within minutes, the information would cascade up the chain of command. Within an hour, American fighter squadrons would be scrambling into the pre-dawn sky. Within a single night, the entire operational structure of Japanese air power in the Philippines would be laid bare, exposed not by espionage or code breaking, but by the accidental turn of a dial in the hands of an exhausted young officer who had simply been trying to tune out interference. This is not a story about heroism in the traditional sense. It is not a tale of battlefield valor or strategic genius. It is the story of a mistake that became a revelation, a moment of human error that collided with technology, timing, and desperation to alter the course of a campaign. It is the story of how chance and preparation, accident and infrastructure, converged in the darkness of a tropical night to demonstrate a singular truth: that modern war is as much a contest of systems and machines as it is of courage and will. By the winter of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a grinding calculus of attrition and distance. The Japanese Empire, once ascendant across half the world's largest ocean, was contracting. Island by island, airfield by airfield, the Allies were closing the ring. The Philippines, seized by Japan in the humiliating days after Pearl Harbor, had become a strategic fulcrum. General Douglas MacArthur had returned as promised, wading ashore at Leyte in October 1944, with cameras rolling and history watching. But returning was not the same as conquering. The archipelago was a labyrinth of jungles, mountains, and fanatical resistance. Japanese forces, though battered, remained dangerous. They still controlled key airfields. They still possessed operational aircraft. And they still believed, with the terrible conviction born of desperation, that they could bleed the Americans enough to force a negotiated peace. Air power was the hinge upon which everything turned. Control of the skies meant control of supply lines, troop movements, naval operations. The Japanese knew this. The Americans knew this. And so the air war over Luzon became a nightly ritual of cat and mouse, of bombers and interceptors, of searchlights clawing at the dark and anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with steel. But there was a problem. The Japanese had adapted. They had learned, painfully, that massed daylight formations were suicide against American fighters. So they shifted tactics. They flew at night. They flew low. They dispersed their aircraft across hidden strips carved into jungle valleys and sugarcane fields. They became ghosts. American intelligence struggled to track them. Reconnaissance flights could photograph airfields, but the Japanese had become masters of camouflage and deception. They hid planes under foliage, built dummy aircraft from bamboo and canvas, moved squadrons under cover of darkness. The Americans had radar, yes, but radar in 1945 was still a crude instrument. It could detect aircraft, but distinguishing between a single scout plane and a bomber formation required skill, experience, and often a measure of guesswork. The frequencies were narrow. The range was limited. Interference from weather, terrain, and the equipment itself was constant. Operators learned to read the screens the way a sailor reads the sea, interpreting patterns, filtering noise, trusting intuition as much as data. Lieutenant Harrington was not supposed to be the one on duty that night. The regular operator, a corporal from New Jersey, had come down with dengue fever. Harrington, technically an electronics maintenance officer, had volunteered to cover the shift. He was competent but not expert. He understood the principles, the theory. He could troubleshoot a blown vacuum tube or recalibrate a magnetron. But he was not a seasoned radar operator. He did not have the hundreds of hours of screen time that taught a man to distinguish a flight of bombers from a weather front or a formation of friendlies returning home from an enemy strike inbound. He was filling in, doing his part, staying awake. The night had been quiet, a few scattered contacts all accounted for. American patrol planes, a flight of B-25s returning from a strike on Japanese positions in the highlands. Routine. Harrington had spent most of the shift fighting boredom and exhaustion, drinking lukewarm coffee from a canteen, smoking cigarettes that tasted like wet cardboard. The tent was stifling. The humidity was a physical weight. He had removed his shirt hours ago, but sweat still ran down his back, pooling at his waistband. The oscilloscope hummed. The generator rattled. Time moved like molasses, and then the dial slipped. What Harrington did not know, what no one knew, in that instant, was that his accidental adjustment had shifted the radar frequency into a band that happened to align almost perfectly with a quirk of atmospheric conditions that night. The ionosphere, that invisible shell of charged particles high above the Earth, was behaving unusually. Solar activity had been intense in recent days. The ionization layer was lower, denser. Radio waves that normally would have dissipated or reflected at oblique angles were instead bending, ducking, traveling farther than they should. The radar pulse that Harrington's station sent out did not simply echo back from nearby targets. It reached, it stretched, it touched aircraft hundreds of miles away, far beyond the theoretical range of the equipment. And it painted them on the screen. Harrington did not understand this. He only knew that the screen had erupted with contacts. His first instinct was malfunction. His second was jamming. The Japanese had been experimenting with rudimentary electronic countermeasures, crude but occasionally effective. But jamming produced a characteristic fuzz, a wash of noise. This was different. These were discrete contacts, individual blips, moving in patterns, formations. He leaned closer. He counted 20, 30, 40, more. They were not converging on Clark. They were circling, holding, staging, as if waiting for something. He picked up the field telephone and cranked the handle. The line crackled. A voice answered, groggy and irritated. Harrington identified himself and began to report. The voice on the other end, a signals lieutenant at operations, cut him off. How many contacts? At least 50, sir. Maybe more. They're still coming in. A pause. Say again. 50-plus contacts. Range approximately 200 miles. Bearing north-northwest. Multiple groups. Moving slow. Holding pattern. Another pause longer. Stay on the line. Harrington waited. The generator coughed. The oscilloscope painted its glowing arcs. The contacts did not disappear. They multiplied. He heard voices on the other end of the line, muffled but urgent. Then the signals lieutenant came back. We're waking up the colonel. Keep monitoring. Mark every group. Get headings, altitudes if you can estimate. Do not leave that screen. Yes, sir. And Harrington? Sir, if this is equipment failure, you're going to be digging latrines till Tokyo surrenders. The line clicked dead. What unfolded over the next 6 hours was a cascade of decisions, improvisations and gambles that would later be dissected in after-action reports, intelligence briefings, and classified studies on the integration of radar technology into tactical operations. But in the moment it was chaos. Organized chaos perhaps, but chaos nonetheless. Colonel Raymond Bledsoe, the air operations commander for the sector, arrived at the radar tent within 20 minutes, still buttoning his shirt. He looked at the screen. He looked at Harrington. He looked at the screen again. This is real? I don't know, sir. It's consistent. It's been holding for 30 minutes now. Bledsoe chewed his lip. He was a career officer, a veteran of North Africa and Italy, a man who had learned to trust his gut but also to verify. Get me a second station. I want confirmation. Another radar unit, positioned 15 miles south, was contacted. They adjusted their frequency to match Harrington's settings. Within minutes, they reported similar contacts. Different angles, Slightly different ranges, but the same general picture. The sky to the north was full of aircraft. Bledsoe made his decision. Wake up the squadrons. I want fighters in the air at first light. I want bombers armed and ready. And I want every available reconnaissance bird up there now. Visual confirmation, I don't care if they have to fly by moonlight. The orders went out. Across Clark Air Base and surrounding fields, engines coughed to life. Pilots stumbled from tents, pulling on flight suits, gulping coffee, asking questions no one could answer yet. Armorers rolled munitions to waiting aircraft. Ground crews swarmed over fighters, checking fuel, oil, ammunition. The night, which had been quiet, became a symphony of mechanical urgency, and still the contacts glowed on Harrington's screen. He had not moved. His eyes burned. His back ached. But he stayed fixed on that oscilloscope, calling out updates, marking positions on a paper chart, his handwriting growing progressively more illegible as fatigue and adrenaline warred inside him. He had become the lens through which an entire air campaign was being refocused, a lens that had been adjusted by accident. The first American reconnaissance plane, a night-capable P-61 Black Widow, lifted off at 05:10 hours. The sky was still dark, but the horizon to the east was beginning to pale. The pilot, Captain Eugene Moss, had been briefed in hurried, fragmented sentences. Large enemy formation, unknown composition, possible staging area, confirm and report. He climbed to 12,000 feet and turned north, his radar operator hunched over a smaller version of the same equipment that had started all this, scanning, searching. They flew for 20 minutes, and then they saw it, airfield lights, dozens of them, strung out across a valley that intelligence had not previously identified as a Japanese base. And aircraft. Rows of them. Fighters, bombers, transports, some camouflaged, some not, some fueled and armed, others clearly in maintenance. Moss circled once, high and careful, while his radar operator took readings and his navigator scribbled coordinates. Then he turned back, pushing the throttles forward, racing the dawn. His report crackled over the radio at 0547 hours. Confirmed. Major air concentration. Grid reference November 7-3. Estimate 70 to 80 aircraft on the ground. Repeat, 70 to 80 aircraft. Looks like a staging area. No sign they've spotted us. Bledsoe received the report in the operations tent, now crowded with officers, maps, and cigarette smoke. He allowed himself a thin smile. Gentlemen, we have just been handed a gift. Let's not waste it. By 0630 hours, as the sun broke over the mountains, the first wave of American fighters and bombers was airborne. P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-25 Mitchells carrying fragmentation bombs and incendiaries. They formed up over Clark and turned north, guided by the coordinates Moss had provided, by the tracks Harrington's radar had painted, by a combination of technology and luck and the simple, brutal logic of striking an enemy when and where he does not expect it. The Japanese were caught completely unprepared. Their aircraft were clustered on the field, wingtip to wingtip, in clear violation of dispersal protocols, but necessary, given the limited space and the urgency of their own planned operations. They had intended to launch a major strike against American shipping in Lingayen Gulf that morning. The planes were fueled, the bombs were loaded. The pilots were being briefed in a bamboo hut at the edge of the strip. They heard the American engines. They looked up. And then the world became fire. The attack lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, 63 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Fuel dumps were blazing. Ammunition bunkers detonated in rolling chains of explosions that sent debris arcing into the jungle. 12 more aircraft were damaged beyond repair. The carefully assembled strike force, weeks in the making, had been obliterated before it could even leave the ground. American losses, 2 aircraft. 1 P-47 hit by ground fire. The pilot bailed out and was recovered. 1 B-25 with engine trouble limped back to base. The disparity was staggering. The implications were profound. The Japanese had believed they were hidden. They had taken every precaution. The airfield in question, later identified as a strip near the village of Bambang, had been carved into a narrow valley, surrounded by high ridges that shielded it from casual observation. It was not on any American map. Reconnaissance flights had passed over the area multiple times without noticing it. The Japanese had moved their planes in at night, under blackout conditions, using guides with shielded lanterns. They had covered the aircraft with netting and foliage. They had posted lookouts, They had done everything that doctrine and experience dictated, and yet they had been found, exposed, destroyed. In the days that followed, Japanese air commanders struggled to understand what had happened. Reports filtered up the chain of command. Interrogations of survivors yielded little. Some speculated that a spy had betrayed the location. Others believed that the Americans had captured documents revealing the airfield's position. A few, more technically minded, wondered if the enemy had developed some new form of detection, something beyond visual reconnaissance. But the truth was both simpler and more complex. There had been no spy, no captured map, no brilliant deduction. There had been an exhausted officer, a slipped dial, a fortuitous band of atmospheric conditions, and a radar screen that for a few hours had performed beyond its design specifications. The Japanese had expected the Americans to be formidable. They knew the industrial capacity of the United States. They had felt the weight of its production in every battle since Midway. They had faced waves of aircraft, fleets of ships, divisions of troops equipped with a material abundance that seemed almost obscene. But they had also believed that courage, discipline, and tactical ingenuity could offset that advantage. They had trained for night operations precisely because they thought it would neutralize American technological superiority. They had dispersed and hidden their forces because they believed that stealth and deception were still viable strategies. What they had not fully grasped was the systemic nature of American power. It was not just about having more planes or better radars. It was about having a network, an infrastructure, a culture of improvisation and problem-solving that turned even accidents into opportunities. Lieutenant Harrington had not invented a new technology. He had not broken a code or devised a brilliant plan. He had simply turned a dial too far while trying to do his job under miserable conditions. But that mistake had occurred within a system designed to exploit such moments. There were other radar stations to confirm the contact. There were reconnaissance assets to verify it. There were strike forces ready to act on it. There were communication networks to coordinate it all. The accident mattered because it happened in a context that could transform accident into action. The Japanese had no equivalent. Their radar technology was years behind. Their coordination between air and ground forces was hampered by rigid doctrine and poor communication. Their ability to respond to unexpected intelligence was limited by fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and a command structure that often prioritized honor over pragmatism. In the tent at Clark Air Base, Harrington finally left his post at 800 hours, after 14 straight hours at the screen. His replacement, a sergeant who had recovered enough from his illness to take over, clapped him on the shoulder. "Heard you started a war this morning, Lieutenant." Harrington, too tired to smile, just shook his head. "I turned a knob." "Well, keep turning knobs like that and we'll be in Tokyo by Christmas." He stumbled out into the morning light, blinking against the brightness. The air was already hot. The smell of aviation fuel hung over the base. He could hear planes landing, taxiing, engines winding down. Pilots climbing out of cockpits, adrenaline still bright in their faces, talking fast, gesturing, reliving the strike. Harrington walked past them, anonymous, unnoticed. He found his tent, collapsed onto a cot, and was asleep before he could remove his boots. He did not know then that his name would appear in classified reports, that his accidental discovery would be studied by radar technicians and intelligence analysts for years, that the engagement he had enabled would be cited in post-war assessments as a textbook example of the integration of technology and tactics. He only knew that he was exhausted, and that the war, for a few hours at least, could proceed without him. The symbolic object in this story is the oscilloscope screen itself. That glowing circular face with its sweeping arm and constellation of blips became a window into a new kind of warfare. For centuries, soldiers had fought with their eyes. They saw the enemy across a field, or glimpsed muzzle flashes in the dark, or spotted sails on the horizon. Victory depended on vision, weather, luck. But radar changed that. It allowed men to see through clouds, through night, through distance. It made the invisible visible, and in doing so, it represented something larger than mere technology. It represented a worldview. American abundance was not just about having more tanks or more bullets. It was about having systems that could absorb mistakes, learn from them, adapt. It was about an economy that could produce not only the hardware of war, but also the infrastructure to support it. The training programs, the supply chains, the repair depots, the communication networks. It was about a society that valued ingenuity and improvisation, that encouraged a farm boy from Kansas to volunteer for a radar shift, even though it wasn't his primary job, that trusted a young officer to make a judgment call in the middle of the night, without waiting for permission from higher authority. The oscilloscope screen, with its glowing promise of vision beyond sight, was a perfect metaphor for that abundance. It was a tool, yes, but it was also a symbol of the American belief that problems could be solved, that information could be mastered, that the chaos of war could be mapped, measured, and managed. The Japanese, by contrast, operated within a paradigm of scarcity and sacrifice. Their economy was overstretched. Their supply lines were broken. Their oil reserves were dwindling. They asked their soldiers to endure what seemed unendurable, to fight with inadequate equipment, to embrace death as a form of victory. There was honor in that, a terrible and profound kind of courage. But there was also a brittleness. Systems built on sacrifice do not adapt well to surprise. When something goes wrong, when a plan fails, there is no surplus to draw upon, no reserve of material or flexibility to cushion the blow. The destruction of the Bambang airfield was not just a tactical loss. It was a revelation of vulnerability. It showed that no matter how brave or disciplined the Japanese forces were, they could not compensate for the systemic advantages of an enemy who could see in the dark, who could turn mistakes into victories, who could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. In the weeks after the strike, American intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese aircrew and ground personnel. Many spoke of disbelief. They had thought the airfield was safe. They had been told that the Americans did not know it existed. When the bombs began to fall, some assumed it was a random attack. Bad luck, a patrol that happened to spot them. The idea that they had been deliberately targeted, that their hidden base had been exposed with such precision, was almost incomprehensible. One captured pilot, a veteran of China and the South Pacific, told his interrogators, "We thought we were invisible. We were wrong." The interrogators pressed him. How did they think the Americans had found them? "Your magic machines," he said. "Your radios that see through mountains." It was not quite accurate, but it captured the psychological impact. To the Japanese, American technology had begun to seem almost supernatural, not because it was actually beyond understanding, but because the gap between what they had and what the Americans had was so vast and widening so quickly that it felt like confronting forces beyond nature. They could shoot down American planes, yes. They could sink American ships. But for every one they destroyed, 10 more appeared. And now, even hiding was no longer effective. The night, which had been their refuge, was no longer dark. The jungle, which had been their shield, was no longer opaque. The Americans could see, and what could be seen could be destroyed. This psychological erosion was as significant as the material losses. Wars are fought with steel and fire, but they are won or lost in the mind. By early 1945, many Japanese commanders understood that they could not win. They fought on because surrender was unthinkable, because their culture and their orders demanded it, because to stop fighting felt like betrayal of the dead. But the hope of a negotiated peace, the belief that inflicting enough casualties would force the Americans to the table, was fading. Each engagement like Bambang, each demonstration of American reach and precision, reinforced the sense that the enemy was not just stronger but fundamentally different, that they operated according to rules and capacities that the Japanese could not match. Lieutenant Harrington learned the full scope of what had happened 3 days later, when he was summoned to Colonel Bledsoe's office. He arrived nervous, uncertain, wondering if he was about to be reprimanded for some procedural violation he had committed during the confusion. Bledsoe was behind his desk, a map spread out in front of him, red circles and pencil marks covering Luzon. He looked up as Harrington entered and saluted. "At ease, Lieutenant." "Sit down." Harrington sat. Bledsoe studied him for a moment, then pushed a folder across the desk. Reconnaissance photos from the strike. "Take a look." Harrington opened the folder. Black and white images, grainy but clear enough. Aerial views of an airfield, or what had been an airfield. Now it was a wasteland of craters, burned wreckage, twisted metal. He flipped through the images, his expression unreadable. Bledsoe leaned back in his chair. "You understand what you're looking at?" "Yes, sir. That was the result of the contact you reported. 63 confirmed kills. Probably more we haven't counted yet. We think we disrupted a major operation." Intelligence estimates we set their air capability in this sector back by at least 2 months. Maybe longer. Harrington nodded slowly. He did not know what to say. Bledsoe continued. I want you to understand something. What happened that night was not standard procedure. You adjusted the equipment in a way that wasn't in the manual. You reported contacts that were beyond the supposed range of the radar. If you'd been wrong, if those contacts had been phantoms or equipment failure, we'd have launched a major operation for nothing. Wasted fuel, risked pilots, looked like idiots. You took a risk. I didn't mean to, sir. The dial slipped. I know. But you didn't dismiss what you saw. You reported it. You stayed on it. You trusted the data even though it didn't make sense. That matters. Bledsoe paused, then pulled out a small box and set it on the desk. You're being recommended for a commendation. I don't know if it'll be approved, but it should be. You did good work, Lieutenant. Accidental or not. Harrington stared at the box. He felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. He had not done anything heroic. He had not charged a machine gun nest or saved a wounded comrade. He had sat in a tent and looked at a screen. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just keep doing your job, and if that dial slips again, report it. Harrington left the office in a daze. The commendation, when it eventually came through, was a Bronze Star for meritorious service. It arrived with a brief citation that mentioned his initiative and technical proficiency in the operation of radar equipment under combat conditions. The citation did not mention the slipped dial. It did not mention the luck. It framed the event as the result of skill and diligence. Perhaps that was how it needed to be recorded. Perhaps the bureaucracy of war could not accommodate the role of chance. Or perhaps in a deeper sense the citation was accurate, because skill and diligence had created the conditions in which chance could matter. Harrington had been awake. He had been attentive. He had reported what he saw. Chance had provided the opportunity, but human action had seized it. The broader strategic implications of the Bambang strike rippled outward through the spring of 1945. Japanese air operations in Luzon never fully recovered. The loss of so many aircraft and the revelation that their hidden bases could be exposed forced them into an even more defensive posture. They conserved their remaining planes for kamikaze attacks, for desperate one-way missions against American ships. The conventional air campaign, the hope of contesting American air superiority through skill and tactics, was effectively abandoned. The sky belonged to the Americans now, not by inches but by miles. This dominance enabled everything that followed. Ground forces advanced more rapidly because they no longer faced constant air attack. Supply convoys moved with greater confidence. Naval task forces operated closer to shore, providing gunfire support and amphibious capability. The recapture of Manila, the liberation of Allied prisoners, the grinding reduction of Japanese strongpoints in the mountains, all were made easier, faster, less costly in American lives because the air war had been decisively won, and that victory, in one of its many threads, traced back to a January night when a tired officer turned a dial too far and saw something he was not supposed to see. History is full of such moments, accidents that become pivot points. Fleming's contaminated petri dish revealing penicillin, the malfunction that led to the discovery of the cosmic microwave background, the wrong turn that started a world war. But accidents by themselves are just accidents. They become significant only when they occur within systems capable of recognizing and exploiting them. Harrington's discovery mattered because the U.S. military in 1945 was such a system. It had the technology to detect, the assets to verify, the force to strike, and the coordination to do all of it within hours. The Japanese, for all their courage and discipline, did not have that. They had brave men and good planes and a willingness to die, but they did not have a system that could turn the unexpected into opportunity. And in modern war, that difference was everything. The epilogue to this story is not about Harrington, though he lived a long and quiet life after the war, returning to Kansas, marrying, raising children, working as an electrical engineer for a farm equipment company. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he told stories about the heat, the food, the boredom. He did not mention the radar screen or the strike or the commendation. Perhaps he understood that his role had been small, contingent, a product of circumstance more than character. Or perhaps he simply did not see the point in dwelling on it. The war had been vast and he had been a tiny part of it, and it was over. But the larger truth, the truth that the Bambang strike illuminates, is about the nature of power in the modern age. The Japanese had expected to fight a war of spirit against material. They believed that their willingness to sacrifice would overcome American wealth, and there was nobility in that belief, a purity of commitment that demanded respect. But they misunderstood the nature of the opponent. American power was not just material, it was systemic. It was the ability to integrate information, technology, logistics, and human initiative into a coherent whole. It was the capacity to make mistakes and learn from them. It was the abundance, not only of goods but of options, of second chances, of the slack that allows for improvisation. The oscilloscope screen, glowing in a dark tent on a January night, was a symbol of that abundance. It represented vision where others saw only darkness. It represented the luxury of having enough resources to develop, deploy, and maintain complex technologies even in the chaotic environment of a forward base. It represented a society that could produce a young man like Harrington, literate in electronics, comfortable with machines, willing to volunteer for an extra shift, capable of recognizing that something unusual was happening on his screen, and reporting it up the chain, even though he was not certain what it meant. The Japanese had expected the Americans to fight like they did, desperately, with every ounce of spirit wrung from limited resources. Instead, they faced an enemy who could make war with a kind of terrible ease, who could afford to experiment, to fail, to try again, who could turn even accidents into assets. That was the ideology of abundance, not decadence or waste as Japanese propaganda had claimed, but a different kind of strength. The strength of systems that bent but did not break. The strength of societies that valued the individual initiative, of a lieutenant from Kansas as much as the grand strategies of generals and admirals. In the end, the war was not decided by radar alone, or by any single technology. It was decided by the aggregate weight of 1,000 such advantages, each one small, each one contingent, but together forming an irresistible tide. The strike at Bambang was a drop in that tide, but it was also a perfect miniature of the whole. A moment when technology, luck, and human agency combined to reveal the enemy, to expose his vulnerabilities, to demonstrate that even in the vastness and chaos of the Pacific, even in the jungle dark, the Americans could see. And what they could see, they could reach. And what they could reach, they could destroy. The screen glowed. The contacts multiplied. The message went up the chain. The planes took off. The bombs fell. And in the wreckage of that hidden airfield, in the twisted metal and the smoke rising into the dawn, was written a truth about modern war, about abundance and scarcity, about the systems that win and the courage that, alone, is not enough. It was a truth the Japanese learned at terrible cost, and one that echoes still in the silent hum of machines that see in the dark, in the legacy of a night when a dial slipped and the sky caught fire.